Sally, it's a real pleasure to have you here. I really wanted to talk to you because you're probably one of the most active people I know in the world at the interface between therapy and psychology and social change and looking at psychology from a social justice perspective. You're a clinical and a community psychologist, and you've worked in a really wide range of roles, including as director of public health and prevention at MAC UK, which works with excluding young people, and then also Art Against Knives, that we'll talk about. You've been past chair of the British Psychological Society's Community Psychology section, founding member of that Housing and Mental Health Network, co-founder of Psychologists for Social Change, co-editor of the Powell Grave Handbook of Innovative Community and Clinical Psychologists. That is a lot. Sally, tell us a little bit about where you started from and how you got into clinical and then community psychology.
Yeah. So my journey's a bit of a winding one. It's never a straight path, is it? Our careers. And when I left uni, I went to work. I'd been really involved in one of our societies called People and Planet, which is a human rights and green justice organization, environmental justice organization. So I ended up going to work for them for a year. But I'd done psychology and philosophy at uni, and my heart was always like, oh, I love psychology. I love learning about people. I love to hear about people's stories and their experiences, like on an emotional level, on a social level. And I couldn't quite fit these two areas of my life together. Like I had this really strong urge, like to work in activism, to be an activist as well and a campaigner. And this division between psychology and sort of the wider world of justice and inequality and ecological destruction was really apparent for me at that age. And I was just like, how do I make a choice between these two careers, both of which I'm love and passionate about, and, both hopefully useful in some way. And so right at that point, I was at this crossroads. I ended up finishing a year at People and Planet and going to do a PhD at UCL in cognitive neuropsychology, which is completely different. I was quite inspired by Oliver Sacks' books, and at the time was quite idealistic about what that would be like. And then doing a PhD, I realized like the human spirit is very far from experimental psychology, and so is activism. So I carried on doing this PhD. I did, carried it on and finished it. And all the time I was also being an activist. And I co-founded the youth section of the Green Party with some friends. And again, it was just like, how do I bring these two areas of my life together? And that's when I started clinical psychology, but I quite quickly found community psychology through Chris Barker at UCL, who's been an amazing mentor at the beginning. And we had one lecture in the clinical psychology, or it wasn't even a lecture, actually, it was an event that Chris Barker put on aside from the main training in clinical psychology about, there was this community psychologist called Eisen Prulintensky, and he was from New Zealand, and he did this lecture for us on the inequalities and mental health. And it blew my mind because I was suddenly like, there is this field that brings these two areas together that I'm passionate about, like that brings together social justice and social, like fighting for social justice, fighting for racial justice, fighting for economic justice, and understanding what that impact, those injustices, how that impacts people's experience, how it impacts their stories, their lives, their inner world, their outer worlds. And I was like, that's it, that's where I've got to go. And so I ended up doing my research on a project that had just started, again, supervised by Chris Barker, called Music and Change, which was the beginnings of MAC UK, which is the charity that I worked for 10 years. And it was working with young people affected by so-called gangs. And I basically did ethnography and just was with them the whole time, and as it was getting set up, and sat in on various things and just listened to their stories, and managed to pass my clinical psychology thesis with it, where people weren't sure if I was going to. But I guess just the short answer is, I grew up with a feminist mum, and very early on, I was not allowed on a men's football team at primary school, or I wasn't allowed in the football team because it was a boys' football team, and I was really, really annoyed by that. And I think that was an early origin story of like my interest in justice and why was that so unfair.
So that was there at the beginning. That was really early on, was it? Was that in your family environment as well? The kind of
I think my mum, yeah, definitely. We had a lot of, political discussions at home, and I mean, it wasn't part of their careers. We had a pet shop and I grew up working in a pet shop, and a very like grassroots family shop that, yeah, I worked in from when I was like 5 or 6 years old. And I think that from my dad's side, I think my interest in like wildlife and my love for wildlife and ecology started through the pet shop really. But we did have a lot of feminist chats and political kind of conversations at that point, but also the role of community of that shop. Like, it was quite an important little shop in our town in terms of like everybody could come in. The kids were left there, for ages. We knew everyone who came in. People would just hang out and chat. And yeah, and then Tesco bought the land and we got booted out. So yeah, it's another story of sort of David and Goliath where we didn't quite make it. But yeah, these are the sorts of impacts that these huge social political forces have on people's lives.
yeah,
And
and
yeah,
it sounds like you experienced that just in the family business, how that affected you.
yeah, and just watching the deeply personal, community orientated shop where we went into schools and chatted to kids about pet care and wildlife, and from that to this deeply impersonal, monolithic kind of superstore, and the differences those things make in people's everyday lives.
So why did you choose psychology as a route, kind of undergraduate and then it's like
I think
university?
I don't want to say LA law or whatever it was, but there was definitely an impact of watching maybe a bit of Columbo and Cracker thrown in. Not giving away my age probably. Uh, but yeah, definitely. Originally, I was just really interested in like the psychology of criminality, I think, and yeah, and how it seemed quite unfair the way people were treated for so yeah, that's how it started really.
Did you feel it sounds like when you were doing psychology, you felt that there was quite a gulf between that and your social justice interest, and it sounds like that frustration was there for a long time, right up to doing neuroscience and
Yeah, massively, like massive gulf, and that's a great way of putting it. Like, yeah, huge. I couldn't understand why um like the only mention of Margaret Thatcher in in my whole psychology education was to do with the Thatcher illusion, which was about face processing and nothing to do with neoliberalism and the impact of capitalism. Like I was like, but why are we talking about microprocesses of the brain? And I went into neuropsychology, so I've only got myself to blame. But even within the context of neuropsychology, like why are we like completely obsessed with these tiny processes when there's these huge giant forces? And I suppose maybe looking back I should have done sociology, I don't know, but I was just like, where are they connecting with people's stories? And especially when I went into clinical psychology, where it's like, yes, but people might have difficulties with their home life and early years, but also look at the context that family is living in, look at the I just it and I wasn't alone, and also people's experiences of racism and poverty and classism, like obviously I wasn't alone in those criticisms, and I found a home in critical community psychology because I was like, this is where they bring these things together. And even within clinical and counseling psychology, I couldn't work out why it wasn't more present. But that I trained 10 years ago or whatever, 12 years, more than that now. So I think it's different now, but at that time it was.
why do you think? Come on, I really want to ask you about community psychology in a sec, but just as you're talking, why do you think that psychology is so depoliticized?
I think because of where it's come from, I think its origins of Eurocentric, its Eurocentric origins, it's kind of Freudian, individualistic, positivist, positivist science methodologies where everything is trying to be controlled, psychology trying to be a science in the same way that the other sciences are sciences trying to do experimental work as its main method of understanding. And I suppose over the years, I've really unlearned all of that as part of my journey. But I really believe that's the origin of it, is that, well, it's our cultural way of being, is to be so individualistic. I don't think we can take psychology out of its context, which is very deeply Eurocentric. So, which is obviously going back to the Enlightenment and everything else. So it's got a long kind of contextual history, hasn't it, I suppose?
Yeah, and there's something about the fact that so many undergraduate students study it. I think it's one of the most popular subjects. A-level students are studying it, even GCSE maybe, and that at all those levels it's studied in a very apolitical, kind of depoliticized way. Seems a real something's really missing that in a way that sociology perhaps is much less so.
Yeah, agreed. And yeah, totally. And it's completely depoliticized in those environments and in those education systems. And also, community psychology is hugely neglected within all of the levels of psychology. Like, it's just really not spoken about. And that is probably the most politicized version of kind of our psychology.
So tell us about community psychology, Sally. How would you, for people who aren't so familiar with it, how would you describe it? What does it do? What's its basis?
Yeah, I mean, its basis in the UK, it's got international history, really. I always think of Paulo Freire, the radical educator in Brazil, as my sort of starting point, but that is not necessarily at all the starting point of many of the ideas. But that idea of, he wrote the book Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which that came out all right, actually. I can't always say pedagogy, but and basically his work was just demonstrating the impact of oppression on people's, what we now call well-being, and how people have the solutions if you give them the opportunities to contribute and to educate in much more participatory ways. I love that idea that's really clear from him, which is this idea, basically like a banking system where you just bank information that's given to you, whereas the pedagogy, the education, that type of education that he liked to do and he encouraged others to do, which is that the basis of community psychology is this idea of sitting in circles and participating in dialogue and talking through the ideas together. And there's obviously loads of different exercises and activities that you can do to bring that to life. But the idea that anyone can participate, whatever your educational level, and that dialogical process is the process of coming to ideas and interventions and solutions. And I guess that idea was taken forward in lots of different ways. And in the USA was the first time, I think, that was badged community psychology. But the ideas, again, were growing in different places or were already present in non-European, sort of non-Western countries. And I suppose this idea is a really different value system to mainstream psychology, where mainstream psychology is, I would say, obsessed with the individual and the individual mind and the intrapsychic processes of the individual. Community psychology is much more about social context. It's much more about values around social justice and equity. So it's got a very strong, orientation towards social change, collective action, and very much about working and supporting and being alongside marginalized, minoritized groups, wherever those groups are and in whatever context, but really being alongside, bringing resources to those groups and allowing them to co-create solutions at a group level, at a community level. And alongside that, personal change happens, but the focus is much less on blaming the individual or even their direct family for the issues that are affecting them, and much more about looking much more systemically and in a meaningfully systemic way. I sometimes get a bit frustrated, and that I appreciate that there might be family therapists here and listening, and I really appreciate the work of family therapy, but sometimes when it's described as systemic therapy, I'm like, well, it is to some degree, but there's many more systems around a person than just a family and their origin family. And community psychology is all about like use of that ecological systems theory of Bronfenbrenner, which is people are nested in multiple systems and contexts, including politics, economics. So for me, as someone who is really aware of the impact of capitalism on people's inner world and on their material world, like if we're not talking about capitalism and poverty with people, then at an individual level, a group level and a community level, then we're ignoring a huge piece of the puzzle of what's impacting people's lives.
Sally, say a little bit more about that when you say the impact of capitalism on people's inner worlds.
Yeah, I mean, this is an area that absolutely fascinates me. Like it's probably like the area that I'm most interested in. It's essentially looking at the way, I mean, I'll go so far as to say neoliberalism, a form of capitalism where the internalization of the key principles of capitalism or neoliberalism have been so internalized that they form the basis of a lot of the negative thinking that most of us have, and including like feeling inadequate at how productive we're being, feeling inadequate at how well we're doing it compared to other people, and the so-called meritocracy of career, how our bodies look, how all of that is controlled by the ideas of consumer capitalism. And that for me is like how that seeps into our minds from a very young age, to me forms our core beliefs. It forms our beliefs about ourselves, the world and others. People, at the heart of it is this idea that everyone's in competition, everything and everyone is in competition with each other, that we're living in a world of scarcity, and therefore we all need to be striving to do the best that we can to get what we need, and to get what we need for ourselves and our immediate family at best. Where actually in other cultures, in other economic systems, that idea of cooperation is at its heart. Collaboration, solidarity, partnerships, these are all ideas in community psychology as well. That we live in an abundant world. We live in a world that is, we can work together really well with the more than human world, as I call it, or nature, and we have what we need. We just don't need as much as we think we need. So all of these ideas are born out of the economic system that we are completely immersed in at all times.
I mean, that's so interesting, Sally, because I guess like a lot of therapists, I spend a lot of time working with people's inner critic and those critical voices. And in most of our models, that's associated with family and maybe parental voices. But what you're saying is actually it goes beyond that to wider spheres, which is to do with the neoliberal context that we're in.
Absolutely. And if I'd had, like, me and a few friends were talking about this, like, if we'd had sort of more time and capability, we would have worked on this idea of, instead of just negative automatic thoughts, which you get obviously in CBT, like cultural or capitalist automatic thoughts, the way in which we are constantly reproducing neoliberalism in our everyday life and in our everyday mind.
Neoliberal automatic thoughts, automatic
Exactly.
neoliberal thoughts.
Yeah, exactly. And and one thing I was going to say actually is for people who are doing individual work, so community psychology works much more at a group community level. And so sometimes it seems like, oh, well, how do I put this into practice if I'm working as a therapist? But actually, people like Professor Mark Burton and Professor Caroline Kagan, who are critical community psychologists in the UK, they're retired now, but Mark Burton, for example, created a formulation for individual work that drew on ideas from community psychology that should be included in all people's formulation, their understanding of their financial situation, understanding of their experiences of discrimination or racism or oppression, and building that into the picture of when you're working with individuals and making sure you're asking those questions. And that at a fundamental level is a very basic thing you can do to include these ideas in work. And I'm sure many people do now, but they didn't when I was being taught.
So there's something about understanding the person within their social and economic context, but it's not just understanding that something outside of the person. It's also understanding the impact that that has inside the person, and are those feelings of inferiority, being judged that many of our clients have, that you would also see as being associated with those kind of wider contextual factors. So it goes right all the way in.
100%, yeah. And I suppose also it's not just the assessment part of like understanding someone's critical thoughts in terms of capitalism, but also then what do you do about it? Like there's a lot of emphasis obviously in individual therapy for the individual to change, and they've got faulty thoughts or whatever it might be, but actually in community psychology the emphasis is on, well, actually how are we challenging these ideas in our society? How are we doing that collectively? We can't do it on our own. I can't bring down capitalism, sadly, but maybe together collectively we can do something, and we can put in some other ideas, tell a different story about ourselves, tell a different story that's about society, that enables a different set of personal change ideas as well. But understanding that, yeah, we're not to blame for this deep conditioning doesn't mean we're not responsible for then doing some change work on ourselves, but just seeing it as what it is, which is conditioning from our culture and our economics.
Sally, there's so many things I want to ask you about this, but just to understand a bit more the history. So you were saying about in the America that United States then developed kind of more formally that term community psychology. In the UK, it started, people started using it, was in the 2000s?
It's a bit earlier than that, probably like 70s, 80s.
Okay.
There's people like Jim Orford at Exeter University. I think he was they were in the 80s. People like David Smale in Nottingham, a lot of white men at this point. So I would point out again that this is the UK Eurocentric view, and there's also people like lots of other people across especially in South Africa, for example, doing this work for the same sort of time. Very critical perspectives on sort of Eurocentric psychology.
Also, you've mentioned community psychology and critical community psychology.
Yeah.
The same thing? Are they different?
Yeah, that is a good question. I mean, I suppose so one of the risks of just saying community psychology is that it's been confused with just having psychologists based in the community, i.e., like, say, psychology doing one-to-one work in a GP office or in a voluntary sector organization that's based in the community. And that is not the same thing as the full meaning of community psychology. And so sometimes calling it critical community psychology, and that actually is a book by Caroline Kagan and others from Manchester, and is a good reference point. It makes sure that it's understood that it's not that. It is actually quite critical of current mainstream approaches to addressing so-called mental health, critical of the medical model of understanding, critical to some degree of one-to-one work, but not completely, but just addressing the balance really of one-to-one work with population level work, policy work, the importance of psychologists and psychotherapists' role in policy work, in community work, all these sorts of things, and also critical of the ideas of the evidence base for psychology as well.
In what sense?
So a lot of, as you all know, but a lot of the evidence that we have, or the research that's done within the field of so-called like mental health, is actually like most of the money, the majority of the research money goes on brain studies, whether that's healthy brain or unhealthy brain studies. It's a significant proportion of the overall research money. And that, as you will know, there's much less research money for mental health compared to physical health. And when the majority of it is going on brain studies or kind of medical model style trials, so like where there's a disorder named and they're testing out different interventions, so like say for OCD, and then they test 2 different types of therapy or medication and therapy, or the majority of research money goes on that. And so already, and very little, sorry, I'll just finish that, very little goes on, if any, to be honest, goes on community level research, or ideas about collective well-being, or there's again, it's growing now. But I've taken this information from this charity called Mental Health Q, I think it's called, where they do an analysis of what mental health research money is being spent on. So even within the research, there's a huge bias already towards brain and one-to-one work. So when people ask me about the evidence base for community psychology, I say, well, give us the funding to demonstrate it, and we can demonstrate it in a different way. It won't be a trial. It'll be through participation of the people involved, doing things like participatory action research, which is both participatory in terms of the power is shared, which is a huge part of community psychology approach. Power is shared with those people that you're working alongside. They have a role in decision making and how what is being researched and why, and the method for that research, and it's often much more creative. So things like taking photos and having exhibitions, or I know people a group called Take Back the Power, who took some young people who were affected by violence in their communities, took them on a residential, and they did this incredible like work on power and how power impacts them. And they came up with all these different ideas, and then they started a podcast on the back of it. And so there's an action point as well. So there's the research itself, finding out about the ideas in different ways, and then there's an action point to it. So it's not just that people are done to or done on, they are involved, they have a voice, they're a significant part of the process, and then there's action taken together to improve whatever it is they identify as the issue at hand.
So it's a very different model of research from the kind of traditional researcher-subject relationship. What happens, I mean, if somebody's listening to this, say they're a young psychologist thinking, I'm really interested in those ideas, is there like jobs is there a kind of community psychology? Can you be a community psychologist? Is it a job you can go into?
It's another great question. I mean, there isn't the same journey into community psychology like there is clinical psychology or counseling psychology. There aren't as many courses. You don't get paid to do it like you do with clinical psychology. And yeah, they're few and far between, the courses. There's again, it's kind of growing. People's interest has massively grown in the last 10 years, I would say, in community psychology. So there are courses responding, but it's a classic example of, you know, it doesn't hit as many mainstream targets as other educational programs in universities.
And is there specific jobs like as a community psychologist?
So not really as such, except for the few organizations. Sorry, just to say, you can become a community psychologist in a university, in a department where there's often roles in teaching and research and practice via a kind of academic route. So yeah, you might be in a department like yours, but with a specialism of community psychology. At University of East London, they have quite a good specialism in community psychology as part of their whole psychology department. So there's definitely university jobs in that way. I think practice jobs on the ground are harder to come by and tend to be within organizations. If they're called community psychologists, like for example, my role, they tend to be in organizations where there is some psychologists' influence or been set up by psychology, or psychologists are involved. But obviously there's lots of other jobs that overlap and are similar. Community practitioners, community development workers, working in local authority in different ways. Yeah, that so you can be quite creative and bring in the ideas. And obviously there's other professions that are similar or overlapping theories and practice, like youth work can be is politicized comparatively to psychology. You know, so there are those other routes as well. But yeah, no, there's not the same infrastructure that there is for all of the other psychologists' roles, like educational forensic counselling. Like it's deeply frustrating, and there's a lot of interest in it, and so it's a shame. I suppose the other route now is some people going to like public health work, and that's, you know, again either in a local authority or if you're lucky within an NHS role. But I suppose my career journey has been mostly in the third sector, in the charity sector, almost predominantly since qualifying, and you have a lot more freedom to work as you want to work. Obviously, you don't get the same benefits of working in the NHS or a local authority in terms of like it's very insecure comparatively. You know, you get paid more equally to everybody else in the third sector. You know, that it's difficult because some of our most frontline people who do the most challenging work with, for example, young people who are affected by these injustices, by these inequalities, by these adversities, the most are not psychologists, they're youth workers who don't get half of the benefits of what psychologists do. They don't get, by standardly, they don't get clinical supervision, reflective practice time. They, you know, have very little kind of support on the day-to-day work that they do and are very much in the deep end. And so there's, you know, lots of opportunity to support people who are doing that frontline work as well.
So community psychology kind of moves and segues into a number of community, youth, kind of more social-based roles, but it kind of comes off these tracks of the traditional psychologist or even counselor psychotherapist roles, which are more kind of individually health, medical model focused.
Yeah.
And it kind of, as a profession, is in some ways, I guess what you describe is more risky, it's more on the edge, but it does have that political dimension.
100%. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What do you think? I mean, something you talked about before is, and I'll just come back to, is from a community psychology perspective, how do you think about things like individual counseling, individual psychotherapy, individual counseling or clinical psychology practice? Do you feel kind of affiliative towards them? Do you see yourself working aside? Do you feel quite critical towards them?
Yeah, I think I think it's obviously very context dependent. I mean, I'm definitely not like the most critical or most anti-therapy person in the critical community psychology world. There are people who are deeply critical of it, you know, and the resources that it takes up. And,
Sorry, Sally, if people
yeah,
wanted to read those people, who should they be reading if
yeah.
they wanted to read something really critical of therapy?
Maybe like David Fryer. Again, these are some of the older older people, rather I don't mean older, I mean but they're kind of, he's retired now, but he was very critical of any individual work, and does amazing work on very structural work. And then in South Africa, there's a woman called Shana Sufla. I'm probably saying her name terribly. And people like Kathy Campbell in the UK and Flora Cornish in the UK, who were both at LSE, where they are more critical of that work and they are more community-based provision.
So there's a kind of spectrum from kind of very anti-therapy. And what would be their basis for being very anti-therapy, anti-individual work?
I think just the depoliticization of it, the emphasis on the medical model, and brain chemical imbalances, which we know have been shown to be, I mean, that's more the medication side of things, but we know feeds into people's understanding of sort of their own distress, and has shown to be, you know, really overplayed by the pharmaceutical industry. I think they'd be quite potentially, I don't know about these individuals that I've mentioned, but people who are very critical might be quite critical of private practice in terms of who it reaches and then what kind of change it creates. In terms of, like, for example, if you're working with a wealthy client who then just becomes better at doing a job, for example, that is actually deeply harmful to others through the way that it impacts structurally, you know, it's that saying of helping people adapt to a sick society rather than changing the sick society itself. And that was a very paraphrased version of it, but I think, and I am definitely a believer in that. You know, I may not be completely anti one-to-one work, but I do believe that if I'm doing what anyone's doing one-to-one work, they should be asking the questions about how we can support people to question and challenge the conditions of society that we're being embedded in.
What does that? So what does that mean, Sally, as a therapist? Because I guess one of the critiques, like even for therapy and social change tasks, is that, oh well, you can't go around telling people what they should vote for or telling clients that they should be activists. So, you know, when you say about taking those things into account, what does that mean in practice if you are doing one-to-one work?
I think it's obviously, yeah, you can't tell people what to vote for, who to vote for. I think it's more about having a critical understanding of, like, we can tell people why, you know, you could apply the same thing to their, you could apply the same thing to family. Like, oh, you can't tell people they didn't have a loving father. You know, once you take people on a journey of self-reflection, of like, what are the ideas and the stories that you're telling yourself that are leading you to feel distressed. And I know, I recognize there's a whole range of different experiences people can be going through which are challenging, and so I realize it sounds simplistic, but I suppose there's many elements to it that apply to all of people's experiences, because we're all in this context, we're all in this culture. And if we don't ask those questions, then people will, that part of themselves will remain a blind spot. So I think we're doing people even further injustice if we're just not questioning some of the bigger picture issues that are affecting them. It would be ridiculous of me if I'm, as a white middle class woman working with young people from the communities of London and didn't ask them anything about their experiences of violence or the police, or because I'd be denying a whole part of their life experience because it's real and because it's there, and it's my blind spot in my positionality that would be creating that. So I think if we aren't critical ourselves as individual therapists or psychotherapists of these stories that we're told in our about our culture and conditioning and about the way things just are, then how, then we won't take that to the people that we work with, and then we may be missing a whole element of their life experience, which makes the whole thing pointless. And also they will probably not want to continue because they're like, I can't bring this to this person because they don't get it. And somehow,
sorry.
No, that's it. I was just going to, somehow it will always link back to those experiences in some way.
So this is kind of circling back to what we were talking about earlier about kind of using maybe community psychology ways of thinking, even if we're working on a one-to-one level. And it sounds like what you're saying is, in the way that as a therapist, I would just naturally bring up family issues, like tell me about your relationship with your parents, because our models would suggest that that's going to be important. What you're saying is that exploring with people their wider context, the kind of realms that they're in, that you'd see as a kind of legitimate area of inquiry. So would you ask someone, for instance, tell me about your, like, say something like class? How do you bring that in then? Do you say, tell me about your class, or do you tell me about your culture? I guess people might be anxious that that's a bit too kind of that might be read as pathologizing or kind of othering or putting someone on the spot. How do you do it?
Yeah, I suppose maybe in my world of where the work that I do, for example, with Art Against Knives with young people, like you see youth workers, for example, at work, and this is just a natural part of their conversation because they understand that it's at the heart of so many young people's experiences that they are obviously affected by not having any money and wanting to make money. And so it's an example of like, because I agree with you, it's hard to ask people about their financial situation. It feels hard. It feels like almost impolite and British, but like, yeah, that's the sort of thing where that gets in the way of, for example, a working class person being able to, attend one-to-one therapy, because that aspect of their life is not going to be seen or like talked about in a kind of natural, authentic way. And I think that's on us as therapists to try and like think about that at an individual, as an individual practitioner. But like, I suppose, so for me, it comes up in all sorts of ways where I can ask, okay, how, if we're talking about the welfare system, the impact of the welfare system on people, like young people are constantly in these challenging positions with the welfare system, as are many other people, and housing is another one. And they are ways in to talking about people's experience of poverty and the stress of poverty. And actually, we've been developing some anti-poverty practice work where, in an intersectional way, we need to be thinking about class and poverty in all of our individual work and community psychology work, and in terms of thinking about how we think about anti-racism work as well and how they connect, bringing it into all of our practices, thinking about as a sector how we collectively challenging poverty, which is, not only growing in this country, but is an absolute disgrace given where we are. And I won't go into the inequality stats because I can't remember them off the top of my head, but I think people know that you only have to look around, you only have to walk around a neighborhood, for example in London, and see the difference in inequality and the housing issues. So I think it should be absolutely part of our work. And if you need to if we need to find out how to best talk about it with people, then maybe asking people and doing a little, bit of co-production around it, of like, how can we bring this more into our practice? How do we talk about this? What's the, if that could be a good way of just starting to answer that question on a personal level.
So if you were a counsellor, say, working in a school, and you wanted to create a space where the kids coming to see you could talk about, say, housing or poverty, one thing to do might be to do a bit of, as you were talking about earlier, participatory research, maybe talking to people about how that can be brought in.
Yeah, exactly. Getting alongside the young people and saying, like, what do you think are the issues facing young people, and then could you go and speak to your friends and say, what are the 3 things that you think are the biggest? I mean, often people say social media, because actually poverty is so part of people's lives that they don't even think of it as part of the biggest issue they face. That's my experience. It's like they're more likely to say social media, even when that they couldn't get to school that day because they didn't have any money for or they couldn't get to our session that day because they didn't have any money for transport, but it's so part of their everyday experience, and that seems so inevitable. It seems so like this is just how it is, that it's like that idea of, a fish swimming in water and not knowing what water is. Like, it's just there all the time.
I guess some counsellors or therapists, say, working in that context, might say, well, with something like poverty, there's not really much I can do about it. So if I'm working on a one-to-one level, I can talk with somebody about their parents or their conditions of worth, or, how, their self-confidence. And those are things that I've got some leverage I can change. If I start talking to someone about poverty and they're saying about living in really bad housing, or they're talking about not having any money, there's not much I can do. So I don't want to bring it up because it's not going to be a good use of time.
Yeah, that's something I think, like, I suppose it's that idea again of where these ideas come from about what we have power to change and what we don't have power to change. And yes, on an individual level, you can't, aside from just giving people money directly, which is something that we should be advocating for in terms of a universal basic income. But I think there are these ideas of, like, how do we support people to empower themselves to challenge, or it's probably the therapists who need more empowering rather than the people that we're helping, in terms of understanding our power and our role to create change. If it's not with that individual, you can work at the policy level and advocate for change at a policy level, but at an individual level, you can talk to the person about what is it how is this affecting you? What do you think needs to change? What do you think needs to happen? Are there ways I can support you to create that change? And then there's really practical things around supporting people, like being proactive around supporting people to get the benefits that they're entitled to, or making sure that they've got the benefits they're entitled to, and writing letters as part of our collective work as psychologists for social change, which I haven't mentioned yet, but the group in the Southwest did a lot of work around a benefits clinic, where they basically trained psychologists how to write letters to support people to get the benefits that they need, and how to support people generally in the benefit system, and how to address the issues in the benefit system collectively. So there was like an individual level response, a kind of group response, and then a kind of policy response.
It'd be really good to hear about psychologists for social change in a sec, but what you're describing is the therapist or the practitioner, that they have some kind of advocacy role. I guess a lot of counsellors would see themselves as neutral, that, you know, I was trained that, you know, if somebody asks you to do a benefit form with them, you say, you know, I wonder why you're asking to do this in this space. This is, you know, that you kind of apologize it. But you're saying that that is actually part of our role, or should be part of our role as mental health workers.
Yeah, no, that is exactly the word I should have used. Thank you. And there are papers on this about the role of psychologists and therapists as advocates, as social justice advocates. I absolutely believe that we should be doing that. I think if there's something even reminding me of that kind of response of like, why are you asking me to do this? Like, it brings something up in me that's quite visceral and powerful about, like, if we need, you know, if you need to ask that question, what is our role, what is our purpose, how are we helping? like yeah, that I don't know, it's an interesting it's an interesting question, because it seems to me so clear that we should be advocates, and there's lots of, you know, written on this about why. If nothing else, we know that research tells us that people who are living in stable conditions with a minimum income are going to get better sooner than people who are living in difficult circumstances. So if you need an evidence base to help answer that, like to help make the case for that becoming an advocate, then it's vast. And you know, 50% of our health and well-being, if not more, is to do with social determinants. So if you actually want to help people get better, then I absolutely believe we should be advocating for them. I say that knowing that people as well, with a little warning, and I don't want to be naive. I say that knowing that people in NHS systems are not being encouraged to do that, put it that way, if not actively told not to do that. So I recognize the systemic barriers to people being able to do it. And I recognize that people's time and limited capacity and resourcing also limit their capacity to do it. So I don't think it's just about an internal belief about therapists or the models that we're using. It's also a hugely systemic and contextual issue about how our role as psychologists or therapists have been defined by the system.
Sally, tell us a bit about Psychologists for Social Change. How long has it been around for? What does it do? How can people get involved in it? Is it just for psychologists?
Yeah, so we started in 2014. Actually, we started with a session, myself and another psychologist called Carl Walker, with some folk from the London Community Psychology Network. And we did a session around the impact of austerity. So austerity was really biting in 2014. And we could see it people could see it in their services. People could see the impact on the people they were working with, could see it on their own well-being in terms of like cuts to services and staffing resources. So yeah, there was a lot happening in that time, and it's only got worse, sadly. But we ran a session about what could we do as psychologists, and started a little campaign called Psychologists Against Austerity. And we did a bit of strategic thinking and worked with some campaigners and activist friends to like think about what role could we specifically have as psychologists to create change. And I suppose this is the other alternative. If you can't bring, if there are barriers to you bringing these ideas into your practice on a one-to-one level, then I would advocate for people to do collective change, because one of the things we realized straight away was that as Psychologists Against Austerity, we had a brand, we had a name that we could all be behind. There was no individual leader as such. We were just getting on with running this campaign. And one of the things that we did was write a briefing paper called the psychological impact of austerity And it was all about the ways in which austerity was damaging people's health and well-being. And yeah, and the intersectionality of that in terms of who it was most damaging, whose health and well-being it was most damaging, which was the minoritized groups and women. And we wrote this briefing paper and then sent it out to all of the campaign groups who were campaigning on austerity as extra fodder for their campaigns. And then we tried to support and show solidarity with some of the campaigns like Disabled People Against the Cuts. We tried to do some work with Black activists against the cuts. And these sorts of groups who were already active and needed as much promotion and awareness building as we could. So we tried to get behind them, as well as develop our own kind of website and campaigns and activities as Psychologists Against Austerity. And then we did a lot of work up to the election in 2015. And then we changed our name to Psychologists for Social Change when we realized there were so many things we all wanted to work on as a collective. Yeah, and we went on protests together. We had banners. One of the things that was really noticeable for me was when I went on the early anti-austerity marches in London, there was a lot of midwives against austerity and nurses like showing up, and lots of healthcare staff showing up and demonstrating, and there was no presence from therapists or psychologists, none. And yet we knew the impact it was having on people's mental health. So for me, it was this huge missing kind of gap. And I just feel like this idea of neutrality has so immersed, I keep using that word today, but we're so immersed in that idea of neutrality as psychologists and therapists that that's part of the depoliticization, but it's also part of our inaction. And so now I think, it's getting better in terms of people taking action on issues that are affecting people, like the cost of living crisis.
And if people want to get involved in Psychologists for Social Change, what can they do, and what does it do? Is it it's a network, or
it's a network. It's not it's not, there's no paid staff or anything like that. We've been really active across the last few years from 2014, but since the pandemic, it's been harder and harder to maintain action. Just because people have become so people are doing it in their spare time, and we've got all these regional groups, and people are really looking for support in these regional groups, and you can find information online if you Google Psychologists for Social Change. There's a website. We also have a Twitter account. But yeah, it's been, for a while, it was actually more like a group of people being in solidarity with each other to keep going through the pandemic. And then but now there's more and more action. There's people doing work on sort of transphobia. There's people doing work on at a community level in their local areas. And yeah, we're always trying to find ways of taking action. But yeah, a lot of people's focus at the moment is on the Gaza war. So a lot of people are diverting towards that as well.
And is it for psychotherapists, counsellors, as well as psychologists?
Yeah. Like, just come on. Sorry, yes, it is. I mean, we describe it as open to anyone with an interest in these ideas, and it's students, it's qualified psychologists, it's researchers, it's people with lived experience, it's trainers and teachers. Yeah, it's a whole range of people. Yes, we've taken on various different campaigns over the years and just tried to raise awareness of the bigger picture issues that are affecting people.
Where do you think, I mean, you're mentioning the Gaza war at the moment, where do you think that I mean, you clearly see as therapists and psychologists, we have a role to play in social change and activism. What do you think our priorities should be? Where do you think we need to go for in the coming years?
Yeah, I mean, like we're in this polycrisis, right? Of like multiple. I mean, I'm starting to focus my attention more and more on alternatives to our current economic system. That's my personal kind of way through this, because I believe the root cause of it is a consumer capitalism. So for me, I think where economic and racial justice meet is really kind of key for me. Um, and I think that addresses then issues of climate justice. And I suppose the way that I'm doing that is trying to look at these alternative systems like community wealth building, a well-being economy, and seeing if there's ways at a local level, but also maybe at a national level, but at a local level, how I can get involved with particular campaigns or setting up workers co-ops or housing co-ops or supporting those to take action, and more as a citizen than as a psychologist, although obviously there's ways that you can, within community wealth building, for example, where you can demonstrate the benefits of these different economic systems. And I'm sort of trying to build on that personally. But I think there's so many ways people can take these ideas forward, often like working at a local level, a neighborhood level. So during the pandemic, we did a few of us were involved in the kind of BPS, the British Psychological Society's response to COVID, a task force about the role of psychology and therapy in it all. But we took a kind of community action and resilience approach, and we're looking out for good examples of local community action and ways in which communities were supporting people. And mutual aid, if you remember, was a huge thing. And that basically was responsible for supporting so many people on the ground at the time. And so there's a lot of networks that have been set up in response to that, in response to kind of mutual aid and connecting people locally. And for many psychologists, that might be a way of getting involved locally. You can obviously also get involved in Psychologists for Social Change, and there's also XR psychologists who are doing work on the climate justice issue. And then I suppose if you're working in the NHS, for example, connecting locally to local community organisations and voluntary and statutory sector and hearing about what they do and inviting them into team meetings, seeing if there's ways that you can work with them at a service level, and seeing if there's resources that you can bring to those organisations, because again, they're often doing that frontline community work. But yeah, personally, it's hard to understand where to put energy at the moment. I think I've also been on a massive spiritual journey, and I think spirituality is another huge area that's left out of our one-to-one work often, and sort of mainstream dominant psychology, but kind of eco spirituality for me, connecting to the more than human world in a really meaningful way, reconnecting to nature's cycles. All these things are the things that keep me going. And yeah, so again, like supporting people with their spiritual kind of development as well might be, personally, I think, is another area that therapists can work on to help people get through crises that we're going through.
I think what you're describing, Sally, is just such a broadening out of the role as a therapist or a psychologist, that our focus is so often on that kind of internal intrapsychic world. And then everything you've said is about wider possibilities and linking it in with social issues, economic issues, global issues, the more than human world, that there's real possibilities there. And I think what I've experienced listening to you is just those enormous possibilities that it's so easy to forget about and to get narrow. And of course, there's challenges in that, as we're talking about. Is there, can you get paid as a community psychologist? It's complex, but there's all those possibilities and opportunities. Sally, it's been brilliant listening to you and talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for letting me chat for so long. I appreciate it. Little rants here and there.
It's more, well, I think it's so important for us to hear that and, you know, look at ways altogether of taking these kind of issues forward. So it's really appreciated. Thanks, Sally.
And thanks to all the amazing work that you all do, and all, you know, all the people who are doing one-to-one work. It isn't easy at the moment, and that people are going through a lot. So, you know, we've got to recognise and acknowledge that too. So it's much needed for many people. So thank you.
Thanks.